Belarus by me, Gavin Yearwood. Situated in the middle of Eastern Europe, Belarus shares a border with Poland to the west, Russia to the east, Ukraine to the south, and Latvia and Lithuania to the north. Belarus takes up an approximate 207,600 square kilometers of land, which is slightly smaller than the state of Kansas. 43% of this land is used for agriculture, which we will go into more detail about later. Belarus is home to a continental climate that hosts cold winters averaging -4 degrees Celsius and cool, moist summers with an average of 25 degrees Celsius. The country is mostly flat, comprised of large amounts of marshlands and waterways, such as the Pripyat and Dnieper rivers. Overall, Belarus has an average elevation of just 160 meters above sea level. A vast majority of the nation identifies as ethnically Belarusian at a whopping 83.7%. Other than this, 8.3% of the population identifies as Russian, 3.1% as Polish, and 1.7% as Ukrainian. Ironically, despite being the ethnic majority, only 23.4% of Belarusians speak Belarusian as their primary language. The majority of the country speaks Russian as their primary language, at 70.2%. The Eastern Orthodox Church holds the religious majority, with 48.3% of the population being a follower. People identifying as non-religious comprise the second largest group at 41.1%, with the Roman Catholics taking a distant third at 7.1% of the population. The Belarusian economy is not independently strong, relying heavily on foreign imported crude oil and natural gas, both for fuel as well as economic benefits. Agricultural goods are the main product of Belarus, especially grains such as barley and rye, and dairy products such as milk and cheese. Fertilizers, farm machinery, and refined petroleum products are also major products of Belarus. The export of these products brought in just over $37 billion for Belarus during the 2020 fiscal year. In the year prior, 42% of those exported goods were shipped to Russia, with 13% going to Ukraine and 7% going to the United Kingdom. Comparatively, goods imported into Belarus held a total value of $35 billion in the 2020 fiscal year. These imports included the aforementioned oil and natural gas, as well as goods such as medicine. A massive 57% of these imports came from Russia, with 7% coming from China and 5% each from Poland, Germany, and Ukraine. Almost 96% of the nation's energy comes from fossil fuels, such as the imported natural gas. Belarus gained independence from the USSR in August of 1991, though the Belarusian Independence Day is celebrated on July 3rd, as that is when the Soviet Army drove the Nazis out of Belarus during the Second World War. The first democratic election was held in Belarus in 1994. This is the election in which current President Alexander Lukashenko was elected. Though this first election was believed to be free and fair by the international community, Lukashenko almost immediately began cutting back the civil liberties of Belarusian citizens, such as freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and gutted the power of the Belarusian parliament. Today, Belarus is a presidential republic in name only, as Lukashenko has effectively created a dictatorship and remains in power regardless of how heavily contested Belarusian election results are. Inside Belarus, the people are growing tired of Lukashenko's dictatorship, and resistance has been steadily increasing. After the 2020 Belarusian presidential election, which is believed to have been rigged, both domestically and internationally, large-scale protests erupted across the nation. These protests were met with force, with police and National Guard using stun grenades, tear gas, and occasionally Kalashnikov rifles to quell the unrest. These protests left over 200 people hospitalized, and upwards of 2,000 people were arrested. Protests are erupting again this year as the people of Belarus voiced their opposition to Lukashenko's complacency in the Russia-Ukraine war. The white and red flag that you can see in the pictures here is the original pre-Soviet era Belarusian flag. This flag has been adopted by the opposition forces as it symbolizes a non-Soviet, non-Lukashenko Belarus. Displaying this flag is a crime in Belarus, as Lukashenko has called it a flag of Nazi sympathizers. Despite this, the popularity of the flag has grown and is now seen widely across the nation during protests of various sizes. Internationally, Belarus, and even Lukashenko personally, has been subject to varying degrees of Western sanctions since the 2006 election, which was deemed neither free nor fair. These sanctions were loosened in 2019, with diplomatic relations between the US and Belarus set to restart in 2020. This was undone with the 2020 protests, as sanctions became strict again. Belarus holds a strenuous relation with Poland on the western border, often instigating conflicts such as the 2021 border crisis. In this crisis, Belarus brought a large amount of Middle Eastern refugees from areas such as Syria and tried to force them across the border into Poland and the EU as a whole. Belarus itself is currently home to an approximate 14,000 Ukrainian refugees, which is slightly ironic given the close diplomatic ties Belarus has to Russia. Of all the ex-Soviet countries, Belarus has maintained what is arguably the strongest relationship with Russia. In 1999, Belarus and Russia signed a treaty to become a two-state union. While this was never officially implemented, discussion began this year on the possibility of Belarus becoming a member of the Russian Federation, which is Russia as a whole. Earlier this year, Belarus hosted the 2022 Russia-Belarusian War Games, a series of military operations conducted jointly between the two nations. The hosting of these games, along with the proximity of the border to Kiev, led to Belarus being the staging and entrance point of the Russian military in the current war with Ukraine. Despite being the launchpad of the Russian invasion, Belarus has not committed any of its armed forces to the conflict as of the recording of this video. However, over the last couple of days, rumors have been spreading that Belarus is planning a military operation into Ukraine due to Ukrainian forces being tied up at the front in the south. If Belarus was to go in, it would take some heat off of the Russians, as Ukrainians would be pulled to defend the northern border. However, Belarus does not have the numbers for a sustained military conflict, with only 45,000 active duty members of the armed forces and aging Russian and Soviet-era equipment. We'll have to wait and see what the future holds. Here are my sources. Thank you, and leave any questions or comments in the discussion board or in the comment section below.